It is understandable that people think that the Quran is just like the Bible. People have been led to believe that all religions are the same. And so it's reasonable to think that all holy books are the same as well. If you're a Christian, maybe you've just assumed that you have the Bible and a Muslim has a Quran. But this is not true. While there are some similarities, the Bible and the Quran are quite different books and function differently in their respective religions. And in today's session, we're going to examine what the books of Islam are and how they work. Well, the first book, of course, is the Quran. The Quran is the main book in Islam, and it is a collection of what Muhammad recited and claimed came from Allah or from God. It is different to the Bible in that with the Bible it is a collection of many different prophets over about a 1500-year period, while the Quran is just the work of one man over about a 23-year period. The chapters in the Quran are called surahs, and there are 114 of these. Each of these surahs has its own traditional name, and they are not ordered in a chronological order throughout the book. They tend to be ordered in terms of length, the longer being at the beginning and then getting shorter to the end. A verse in Arabic is called an ayah, and so there are surahs and ayahs for the Quran. But you need to be careful with the verse numbering system because there's not a standard numbering system. And so if you get a quote and it says that it's at this surah and this ayah, this chapter and verse, and you can't find it, then you just need to look around, maybe 5 verses on either way, because they don't have a standard numbering. That may well be changing. But you need to understand firstly that the Quran does not contain all that a Muslim needs to know about his or her religion. For instance, Muhammad and what he said was in response to different situations in his life. And he would say that God has told me this. But the context for that situation that led to what he said is not in the Quran. So it's a book without a context. Many of its verses are not clear. And in fact, there are many, many instructions which are basic to Islam which are not even in it. You see, there is no doctrine in Islam of the sufficiency of Scripture. This is a uniquely Christian doctrine, and so as a Christian you must not assume it for Islam. This other information that is required in Islam comes from the Islamic traditions. So if you want to understand the Quran, you must go outside of it. Now, the first source of Islamic tradition is what's called the biographies of Muhammad's life, or the Sirat literature. These are actually the earliest Islamic sources that we have besides the Quran. And the earliest of these is by a man named Ibn Ishaq, who died in 768 AD, which is about 150 years after Muhammad. His biography provides the chronology and the context for Muhammad's life, and so the context for understanding the Quran. It's interesting to look at the different biographies that are written over time, and you can actually see how there's an editing process that happens and how Muhammad's life is really changed over time. But Ibn Ishaq is the oldest one we have, and that's the one I recommend that you use because it's the oldest account that we have. But please do note that it's quite late. It's 2 or 3 generations after Muhammad. That's the earliest account that we have of his life, which is quite different to the Gospels, which were written by Jesus' disciples, by the eyewitnesses who were there, by Jesus' own generation. These are several generations after Muhammad, so we only have later information on his life. The other accounts the other traditions that we need to know are what's called the Hadith. Now, a Hadith is different to the Sirat. The Sirat is the biography, but a Hadith are just short accounts of his life. Short accounts of the actions and teachings of Muhammad on particular topics. And so the Hadiths are books which are a collection in topical order of different subjects. and it will say Muhammad said this on this subject, and it'll give a whole lot of references to what he said, and you would have read some of those in your preparation. Again, if you look at the date here, they're quite late. The most authoritative collection is that of Imam Bukhari. And remember, Muhammad died 632 AD, Imam Bukhari is 870 AD. So he's now into the 3rd Islamic century when he gathered together these accounts of Muhammad's life. Imam Muslim is the other main account. These are the two main collections, and the thing you need to notice is that Islam has many books. So I've given you a picture there of the collection of the Hadith by Imam Bukhari. These are like encyclopedia sets. Now, what are their function? Well, these don't so much provide the chronology of Muhammad's life, but they do provide the context for particular verses. And so when you read the Hadith, it might quote a particular verse and then give you the context behind it. And in fact, there was a reference to that in your preparation. Now, at this point, you see how the Bible and the Quran are different, because the Bible actually provides the context for understanding Jesus. The Old Testament begins with creation. That's the first context you need to know about, isn't it? It begins with creation and brings you right up so that when Jesus comes, you can understand who he is and what he's come to do. But it's not like that with the Quran. You need these other books to provide that context. The Hadith also clarify what is unclear. For instance, the Quran talks about Abraham's sacrifice, and it talks about his different sons. But yet it doesn't tell you which son was sacrificed. So let me just read that for you now. It says, "We gave him, Abraham, news of a gentle son. And when he reached the age when he could work for him, his father said to him, 'My son, I dreamt that I was sacrificing you. Tell me what you think.' He replied, 'Father, do as you are bidden. God willing, you shall find me steadfast.' And when they had both submitted to God, and Abraham had laid down his son prostrate upon his face, we called out to him, saying, 'Abraham, you have fulfilled your vision.'" Now there's the version of Abraham's sacrifice in the Quran. But which son was it? And that is actually an important issue. Well, the Hadiths tell the Muslim which son this was. Now, the problem is, for us as Christians, it was clear that it was Isaac was the son. And the Hadiths, because they come from a later time, they're not just accounts of what Muhammad did, but many of them are commentaries telling what Muhammad would have done. And so the earliest Hadiths say that Isaac was the son that Abraham sacrificed, but the later Hadiths say it was Ishmael. So you can actually sometimes get contradictory Hadiths on that point. But finally, as I said before, the Hadiths also provide basic Islamic instruction not found in the Quran. When you see Muslims praying in line, praying 5 times a day, the instruction for that is not in the Quran. The form of the prayer is not in the Quran. Parts of it are, but the whole manner, the whole ceremony, that's not in the Quran. The pilgrimage to Mecca and what is to be done, that doesn't come from the Quran. It all comes from the Hadith. Even issues like circumcision, really fundamental things, are not mentioned in the Quran. They may be mentioned, but no details given, or in the case of circumcision, not mentioned at all. Now, I've given you a page there from Bukhari, from Imam Bukhari, and you can just scanning your eyes there, just see all the different books that he has within his collection. And these are all the different topics that he covers. And you can see them. There's the book of revelation, of belief, of knowledge, of washings, ablutions, about how to wash yourself and get ready for prayers, of menstrual periods, of prayers, of times for call to prayer, of making peace, of jihad, fighting in Allah's cause. You know, you can just go to the internet, and I've given you the URL there. You can go there and click on there and get all the summary of the teaching on these different topics. Now, the final subject I want to look at, the final book, of what's called the Tafsir literature. The Tafsir is the Islamic commentaries on the Quran. And what the Tafsir scholars did, the commentators did, was that they gathered together their study of the Quran They gathered together the biography material, the Sirat literature, to find out its context. They got all the information from the Hadith, and they bring it together to interpret the Quran. And I've given you a few of the famous commentators there. And there is a website called tafsar.com, and you can get all the main Islamic commentators there, and that's in your notes as well. And it's from these books, all the books that I've mentioned, that Islamic law or Sharia law is derived. That is the law of Islam that is to be brought for the Islamic Empire. Now, this raises the issue as to how do we read the Quran properly? How do we read it in context? Because one of the difficulties we have in the West is that people quote the Quran and they quote this, they quote that, and then other people will say, well, you're quoting it out of context or something like that. But how do you read it in context? How do you make sense of this book? Well, the first thing to note, and we've already touched on this, is that the Quran revolves around Muhammad's life. The Quran revolves around Muhammad's life. Thus, the main characters in the Quran are the main characters in Muhammad's life. They are Muhammad himself. Much of the Quran is addressed to him and to do with him. There's Allah, the angels, genies, Satan, Muhammad's wives, Jews and Christians, all the people of the book, the earlier prophets, the polytheist Arabs that he's trying to convert. There's the genuine followers of Muhammad, or the hypocritical followers of Muhammad. And you must remember that it is normally the interaction of these characters that you are reading about when you read the Quran. It is the interaction of these characters that is being addressed in what Muhammad says. Now, what are some of the situations that Muhammad found himself in that he would give the Quran to and say that God spoke to me in this way? Well, sometimes it could just be a general observation or something general. So he's observed something in creation, maybe the sunrise or something, and he sees the power of God and writes a beautiful surah about it. And that could be part of the Quran, a general observation. Sometimes it might be a prayer, as in the case of Surah 1 or 113, 114. And some of these prayers are actually used in their liturgy, in their Islamic prayers. It might be a question that is posed to him, and he would answer it by saying part of the Quran. It might be a legal decision or a judgment or a fatwa that he gives. It might be a challenge where they challenge him in a certain way and he gives part of the Quran. It might be a military situation. It might be a question as to what to do with all the booty that they were getting now that they were conquering so many people. It might be a warning about unbelief, or it might be in response to a fear about witchcraft. What should Muhammad think about this? Muhammad might actually be rebuked, as in Surah 80, as you read in your introduction. Or there might be, in fact, a very personal family issue, which we will look at in a moment. There might be an encouragement for Muhammad or an encouragement for all Muslims. Or sometimes it might actually be there to justify Muhammad's behaviour. Now, very often when you read it, it sounds like a sermon or a debate, with application and illustrations coming from the biblical stories that we're familiar with. But it's not really retelling the biblical stories. It's rather using them as illustrations to prove a point that Muhammad wants to make. Well, I want to look at just a couple of verses now from the Quran to show you how these situations could even be particularly very personal for Muhammad. So I want to look at a family issue here between him and some of his wives. Now, the traditions tell us that on one particular occasion, the ruler of Egypt gave to Muhammad a beautiful slave girl called Miriam, a Coptic slave. And apparently Muhammad had made a promise to Hafsa, who was one of his wives to whom this slave was given. He made a promise to her not to have sex with this Coptic beautiful girl. Now, the traditions are slightly different here. Some of them say that this promise he made caused a scandal, the fact that he made this promise. Other traditions say that he went and did have sex with this girl. So it could be one of those. But the result was that Muhammad was given a certain part of the Quran as this scandal arose, that Muhammad was not to have sex with this woman, or that he did have sex with her. And let me read to you from Surah 66. Prophet, why do you prohibit that which Allah has made lawful to you in seeking to please your wives? Allah is forgiving and merciful. He has given you absolution from such oaths. You see, what is it that Muhammad had prohibited? Well, he'd prohibited himself from having sex with this slave girl because his wife had asked him to do that. This had caused an issue, but what did Allah do? Allah said, I have cancelled that promise. You no longer need to keep your word. And so he was free now not to keep his word. That's a very personal thing, isn't it? You make a promise, but now Allah has said you don't have to keep that promise. We see this again in a very personal way with the Quran's restrictions on marriage, to which Muhammad is given special exemption. Prophet, we have made lawful to you the wives to whom you have granted dowries, and the slave girls to whom Allah has given you as booty, the daughters of your paternal and maternal uncles, and your paternal and maternal aunts, who fled with you, and any believing woman who gives herself to the Prophet and whom the Prophet wishes to take in marriage. The privilege is yours alone, being granted to no other believer. You see, Muhammad had special sexual privilege to take any woman he wanted, but it was only for him, not for anyone else. It is little wonder that in response to the above verses, his wife Aisha, who was his favourite wife, said, I said to the Prophet, I feel that your Lord hastens in fulfilling your wishes and desires. Sometimes there could be a challenge put before Muhammad. Here is one in which we see a challenge. And when we exchange a verse in one place for another, and God knows very well what he is sending down, they say, thou art a mere forger. Now, what was happening there? Well, you see, Muhammad was actually changing the content of the Quran. We're going to read about this just in a moment. But he would actually change the content of the Quran. And when this would happen, people were saying to him, you're a forger. You see, and so the answer comes when we, that is God and the angels, when we change a verse, you know, when we change it, we know what we're doing. And even though they're calling you a forger, well, you're not a forger because it's us who is changing it. So there was a challenge to Muhammad. You're changing what you're saying. You say this and now you say something else. This isn't from God. But then he would bring this answer. And this is in fact the background for what you may have heard is called the Satanic Verses. The Satanic Verses was a situation where in order to win over the Meccans, Muhammad recited verses that gave credence to their idols and to their gods. And this indeed did give him acceptance among the Meccans. But then after a while he changed that and said, no, those verses are wrong. Allah has changed those verses. Those verses were given to me by Satan. And I've given you a URL that you can follow that up in an article I've written on it. Now, this challenge that we've just read here to Muhammad of changing the verses shows another aspect of the Quran. Not only does the Quran revolve around Muhammad's life, but it also evolves around Muhammad's life. It evolves around his life. In fact, individual verses in the Quran evolved over time. Let me read to you from a hadith where we see a verse written once and then the new version of the verse again at the end, and you'll see how they're different. Narrated by Al-Bara. There was revealed, and then he quotes from the Quran, not equal are those believers who sit at home and those who strive and fight in Allah's cause. That's from Surah 4, verse 95. You see, there was revealed that part of the Quran, that those people who sit at home are not equal to those who go out and fight for Allah's kingdom. Okay, then we read the next part. The Prophet said, call Zayd for me, and let him bring the board, the ink pot, and the scapular bone, for the scapular bone and the ink pot. Then he said, write. So the scapula, bone, and the inkpot are actually how they used to write in those days. So he's called in his scribe and he wants him to write something down. He said, write, not equal are those believers who sit. And then it stops. And at that time, Amir bin Maktam, the blind man, was sitting behind the prophet. He said, O Allah's apostle, what is your order for me regarding the above verse, as I am blind? So instead of the above verse, the following verse was revealed. Not equal are those believers who sit at home, except those who are disabled by injury or are blind or lame, etc., and those who strive and fight in Allah's cause. So you see there how that verse was given by Allah at first, but then later on was changed to now say, well, they're not equal except for the disabled. And so that individual verse evolved over time. But the main evolution that comes in the Quran comes from Muhammad's move from Mecca to Medina. While Muhammad was in Mecca, he preached peace. He preached restraint and persuasion. He was a powerless prophet. He didn't have an army. But when he moved to Medina, he began the Islamic State and formed an army. And now he preached statehood. He preached legislation. He preached the redefinition of the Arab religion. He preached conquest. Now, I'll give you an example of how this develops over time. We'll look at the development of fighting around the life of Muhammad. Now, earlier on in his life, we read this verse from Surah 52. This is talking about people who are persecuting the Muslims. He says, let them be until they face the day when they shall stand dumbfounded, the day when their designs will avail them nothing and none will help them. And besides this, a scourge awaits the wrongdoers, though most of them do not know it. Therefore, wait for the judgment of your Lord. All right? So very clear, don't fight, just wait for God's judgment. Don't fight. However, when Muhammad then left Mecca and went to Medina and began his army, he said something different now to persecution. So this is from Surah 8 this time. Fight them until persecution is no more, and religion is all for Allah. Now in that case, it's fighting in self-defense. But then, once he had conquered Mecca and the tribes around him had been subjugated, he now turns his attention to the rest of the world. And it's now no longer fighting in self-defense, but it's now conquest to bring the Islamic Empire. And we see this in really the last main surah of the Quran, Surah 9. Fight those who believe not in Allah, nor the last day, nor hold that forbidden which has been forbidden by Allah and His Apostle, nor acknowledge the religion of truth, even if they are people of the book, until they pay tribute with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. Now, you can see how it develops there. First of all, don't fight, wait for God's judgment. Secondly, fight in self-defense. Finally, go and conquer, and to all those people who don't accept Islam, bring them into submission and make them feel subdued and make them pay the tribute. You can see a similar example around wine. Initially, they drank wine until Muhammad lost a battle due to his troops being drunk, and so wine was then banned. And so wine starts off being allowed in the Quran but ends up being forbidden. So the way that theological ideas develop in the Quran really has three different sections. Firstly, there's the Meccan surahs that you need to consider. What Muhammad said when he was in Mecca. Then there is what he said in Medina. It may not have changed. So he's teaching about there being one God. That is the same always. But on other issues, it does change. And then finally, the later Islamic community themselves can change the doctrine a bit as they tease it out. And that can happen in the hadiths and the Sharia literature. So you need to understand that in the Quran, it's an evolving doctrine that happens through the Quran and into the Hadith. Now this means that you can easily quote the Quran and the Hadith selectively. And so you need to be careful. And we see people doing this with Islam today, don't we? We'll have Muslims assuring us and saying, Islam only teaches to fight in self-defense. That's all it teaches, to fight in self-defense. And there is indeed a verse that you can find to show that. But then we have the radicals there saying, we must conquer the infidels and bring them into submission. And there's a verse you can quote for that. So how do you apply it then? I mean, which bit do you use? How do you apply the Quran if you're a Muslim? Well, there are four options that Muslims do. The first is to be completely unaware of this evolving nature and in many ways contradictory verses within the Quran. Just to be unaware of it. And that's where I guess many Muslims are. They don't know they're teaching all that. Well, they're just unaware of this. A second response is to give up on Islam and to leave Islam. One of the main reasons Muslims leave Islam is they see the way that Muhammad changes his teaching over time, and they say, how can this be the word of God? The man is just making it up as he goes along. And he's giving himself special permission to do special things with his wives. And that's why many Muslims have actually given up on Islam, because they just say, this is ridiculous. Other Muslims, the third response is to pick and choose whichever verses you like. So if there are liberal Muslims or Sufi Muslims who want to just have a gentle expression of their faith and not to be too serious about it, but just to be, just to have some spirituality, well, you just pick the verses that you like. The same way I guess some people do that with Christianity. But how does the Quran itself answer this question? Well, it answers it with what's called the doctrine of abrogation. And there are several verses in the Quran which actually address the issue of how what Muhammad was saying was changing. So let me read to you from Surah 2. It says, none of our revelations do we abrogate or cause to be forgotten, but we substitute something better or similar. Knowest thou not that Allah hath power over all things? So we see here that the Quran acknowledges its own changing in time. And so the question then comes, well, how do you apply this doctrine of abrogation? How is it applied? There are two ways. One of the ways that Muslims do this is they say that whatever Muhammad said last on a subject, that's the final word, and that's what Allah wants us to do. So when it comes to fighting or when it comes to wine, the last word is the word we're on. So that is, we're meant to be conquering the nations. We're meant to be not drinking wine. The last word's the final word that we're to live by. The second method is slightly different. The second method of applying abrogation is to say, just as the Quran evolved around Muhammad's life, so too it will evolve around the Islamic community's life as that Islamic community changes in time. So as the Islamic community changes in time, what parts of the Quran are relevant to it will also change in time. Thus, the context of the Islamic community determines which aspect of the Quran they are to obey. Now, I've given you a little table here to have a look at. But what it means is that for an Islamic community, say in Australia, they are a minority. They are like Muhammad in Mecca. Remember Muhammad in Mecca? He was powerless. He was simply preaching Islam, and he was given a hard time. Well, that's sort of like the Muslims in Australia. They're not given a hard time here. They're supported in many ways, but they're a minority. And so the Meccan surahs and the way Muhammad said to act in Mecca, well, that's the way they should be acting. But Muslims can also find themselves in another situation, that is when they're in control. Say in Saudi Arabia or in Iran or in other countries, where they're in control. Now in that context, well, the Medinan surahs, that's what they're to follow. And so all of the Quran is relevant. It just depends upon the context of your community and where your community is up to. Now this is why knowing when a particular surah of a Quran was spoken by Muhammad is very important. It's important to know, when did he say this? When in his life did? Because when it applied to him is when it should apply to me as well. There is no exact agreement as to the chronological order of the surahs of the Quran, but they can be known in general terms. And I've given you a table there so that you could locate a surah to find out when did Muhammad say it. Now, this evolution within the Quran, this development of its ideas, also shows us the goal or the trajectory of the Quran, the movement within the Quran itself. And it has a very clear goal. Its goal is the movement from a minority group to the formation of an Islamic state. Because that is the life of Muhammad, and that is what the Quran is all about. That's the movement and the progress within the Quran. And this is the goal of the devout Islamic community, that they should imitate Muhammad and bring about the Islamic state, the place where Sharia law is enforced and brought about, and where Muslims can live under the laws of Allah. What this means is that you can only see what Islam is really like when it controls a country. To know what real Islam is like, you must look at a country that it controls. A country like Iran or Saudi Arabia or some other one. But there is no use looking at Islam as it is practiced in Australia, the US or the UK. For this is only the beginning of what Islam would look like. It is not what Islam would finally look like. If you want to know what Islam looks like, you must look at the countries that Islam controls. But to conclude, there are many holy books in the religion of Islam, not one. There are many holy books. The chief book is the Quran, but without the Islamic traditions found in the Sirat and Hadith literature, it is a book without a context and difficult, if not impossible, to fully understand. The Quran does not contain most of the basic practices for the Islamic religion. These too come from the Hadith and Sirat literature. And finally, the Quran is a book that revolves and evolves around Muhammad's life. Because of this, some of its doctrines change as the situation in Muhammad's life changes, and its goal is the formation of the Islamic State.